Okay, so I'm Jon Hughes. I'm a reader in German and Cultural Studies in the Department of Languages, Literatures and Cultures at Royal Holloway. And I obviously teach on our German programs, but I teach more broadly also on our film studies courses and in many of our courses taken by our students of comparative literature and culture. So I teach across mainly German topics, but some comparative and international topics. A lot of my teaching has a focus on interdisciplinary methods and different media. So I teach some literature, but also quite a lot of film topics. The first topic that I'd like to talk about today is the film Das Leben der Anderen, which was directed by Florian Henckel von Donnersmarck in Germany in 2006, which the film is, not only was it the first film directed by Donnersmarck, made his name and got his career off to a very impressive start, but it was one of the most successful German language films of that particular decade, indeed of all time. The film won the Oscar for the Best Foreign Language film and has enjoyed wide international success as well as success in the domestic German market. And for that reason, it's a particularly interesting example of a successful German film from recent years, or from the last 2 decades or so. The film, what makes the film interesting and important perhaps, is that it is widely understood or widely recognized as one of the first serious attempts to make a popular film, a film with a wide popular reach, set in the former German Democratic Republic, the old East Germany. So this is a film with an historical setting, a Cold War setting, set in the 1980s, set in a period in which Germany was divided. It's set in Berlin in that period, and it shows us a city and a culture and a regime very much within the repressive control of the ruling party. So it's a film which makes a serious attempt to create a sense of time and place specific to that era and that moment in time for the divided Germany. And in that sense, it was quite different from many of the other films that had dealt with this subject matter and had been set in the former East, the former Eastern Germany, made in Germany since reunification in 1989, 1990. So many of the most popular and successful films that were broadly concerned with East Germany had been relatively light-hearted comedies, for example. There was a wave of films known as Ostalgie films, including the films of Leander Hausmann, such as Sonnenallee, or even a film which many of you may have seen, Goodbye Lenin, which is set just at that moment of reunification. This film is set in the GDR in the years preceding reunification, but really at that cusp before things had really begun to change. The story, and I'm sure many of you will have already seen the film, the story is focused on 2 individuals and depends really for its effects on a process of developing parallels and contrasts. So we have our 2 central characters, the dramatist Georg Dreimann and the Stasi spy Gerd Wiesler. So this, of course, the Stasi, of course, was the German state secret police, the East German state secret police. And this character, Wiesler, is established right at the start as an archetypal, loyal servant of the state, almost robotic in his approach, unwavering in his willingness to obey orders and do whatever is required of him. So he's a brutal, quite cold, quite frightening character, and the opening scenes of the film establish him in this way. By contrast, the man with whom he is tasked with spying on, the dramatist Georg Dreimann, is a man of culture, a man who has a rich private life, a loving relationship with his girlfriend. He's embedded in a tradition of German art and literature and music, none of which the Stasi man Wiesler has. And so we have a real sense of 2 very different lives coming together. What makes the film interesting is that the film tracks a process of change or transformation, particularly on the part of Wiesler, the Stasi spy. So we follow him through a process through which, by his experience of spying on this man and his relationship, he becomes more human himself. For example, through exposure to art. He reads some Brecht at one point, he listens to music. He seems to become almost a better person. And by the end of the film, we have this crucial moment in which this robotic, unpleasant Stasi man takes a personal risk, disobeys orders, and intervenes in order to help the man he's been spying on. And he suppresses compromising information on Dreimann at the end. And this is the turning point, or the crux of the story. The moment in which we see that a man has apparently changed or transformed in the course of the story. Now, the themes in this film revolve around questions of ethics and agency and power and knowledge, and it deals with those and explores those in some quite interesting ways, I think. However, the film has also been subject to some criticism. One of the reasons that the film has been subject to a critique is that the central character, our spy, our representative of the Stasi, does what I have described. He makes this decision at the end to disobey orders. He becomes a good person. Now, of course, the Stasi has the reputation of being one of the most intrusive and unpleasant agencies of its type. There are, in fact, very few examples, in fact, no real examples of any Stasi agent doing anything like what we see this man do in the film. The director, Donnersmarck, has pointed to one or two examples of Stasi agents going against orders or doing things which they weren't supposed to have done and being punished for that. But there is no historically proven example of someone going quite this far. Now, for some, this delegitimizes the film. It presents, it almost makes our Stasi agents into a hero figure, a moral character with whom we can almost relate. And for some viewers of the film and critics of the film, this is problematic. We might draw a comparison, for example, with another historical film made in the same era, Oliver Hirschspiegel's Der Untergang, Downfall, released in 2004, just a year or two before Das Leben der Anderen, which is set in the final months during which the Nazi regime collapses in 1945. And that film, whilst it was even more successful internationally than Das Leben der Anderen, has also been criticised for the way in which it's dealt with its historical characters, in particular the portrayal of Hitler as a rather human figure, not necessarily sympathetic, but in a weird sort of way relatable. And some of the other characters in this film, most of whom are historically documented characters, people who really lived, many of these people are presented in more or less sympathetic terms. And historians have pointed out that that film suppresses certain information, distorts certain facts in order that audiences have, if you like, identification figures, have moral exemplars with whom they can relate. And Das Leben der Anderen does something similar. Whilst Gerd Wiesler, the character, is entirely fictional and the story is entirely fictional, it nevertheless tries to be realistic in its setting. It tries to create a real sense of place. And yet it has this central device which, for some historians at least, is unrealistic, is implausible. But for me, and this is my take on this, what we have is a humanly plausible moment in this film, this moment of transformation. And for me as a viewer, and for many German viewers of this film, whether or not this could or actually did happen is less important than the underlying theme or message, which is that all people are capable of change and that redemption is possible. And if we think of the story perhaps more as a sort of fable rather than an attempt to present an historical document or something like that, then perhaps the film makes more sense to us. This is a story not only about an individual finding redemption, but somehow a story about an entire regime or a nation even. All of East Germany, in a way, found its way to redemption in this period. And Donnersmarck, in discussing this film, has pointed out that the revolution of 1989, if you want to call it that, the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989, wouldn't have been possible if all of the functionaries, Stasi agents, members of the police and the army, if they'd all still believed firmly in the regime, it wouldn't have happened. There'd have been something more like we saw in Tiananmen Square. And that didn't happen because they'd lost faith. They'd changed in a sense. And in a way, that's what this film is trying to communicate, how people can change and how there is redemption for everyone. And that's, of course, what we get at the end of the film, where Dreimann discovers after reunification what this man has done for him, because the two never really come together in the film, despite the close contact between them. He discovers it later and dedicates a book to him, not by name, but according to his Stasi agent's code, which he discovered by reading his files, as many former citizens of the GDR chose to do after 1990. So that's my take on the film, why it was problematic, and why I think directors and artists more generally have the right to poetic license when dealing with historical subjects and historical settings. So I'd be interested to know what you also think of this, and whether or not you agree or disagree with my take on the film.